We've been betrayed. It was all a lie.
I don't know about you, but I've been quite surprised that the return of the Jeffrey Epstein scandal has exploded with such incredible force that it seems like it could actually blow apart the entire MAGA coalition, the MAGA universe, leaving just screaming, frenzied shards of what it was. I don't know about you. I'm also kind of shocked that this civil war was launched by just a single Elon Musk tweet. So I thought we could explore, how and why this is happening, what it could mean for the future of the US and the movement, and we're going to use some theory tools for that. I always assume that the MAGA world, which includes its influencers, its tech oligarchs and dark triad personalities and neo-Nazi racists and white Christian nationalists, I assume they all knew that Trump was lying through his teeth about his relationship with Epstein. I assume they understood that the so-called Epstein files, whatever that actually means, would never be released. Yet the declaration by the White House that there was no Epstein list and no files, that the case was permanently closed, has set off like a massive firestorm. The scandal is so big that it threatens to permanently fracture Trump's base. It could even lead to him being dethroned from power, perhaps. So I think part of the ongoing fixation with the Epstein case comes from its murkiness and weirdness and its ambiguity. And it feels like no new clarity ever seems to emerge despite massive waves of media attention and public focus. The details just remain kind of funky. I mean, for instance, what was going on with Victoria's Secret founder Les Wexner? Why did he give Epstein so much power, so much money, control over his fortune, estimated in the billions, plus his $77 million Park Avenue mansion and his Ohio estate? Did Epstein blackmail or hypnotize Wexner in some way? Where did Epstein's wealth even come from? How did this 21-year-old Epstein even get a job as a math teacher at Dalton, which is one of New York's most prestigious private schools, without having a college degree? Did he lie in his resume? So was he just a talented confidence man from the beginning? What was this strange power, this sort of Svengali-like power he seemed to wield over so many people? Just to take a little dive into how weird and insular and even surreal the whole Epstein story is. It turns out that the man who hired Epstein originally at Dalton was Donald Barr. Donald Barr was the headmaster at Dalton. Donald Barr was also the father of U.S. Attorney William Barr, who would later investigate Epstein's death. Now, Donald Barr was also a science fiction writer. One of his novels, Space Relations, which I think came out in 1973, is literally about a planet ruled by oligarchs who engage in child sex slavery and rape against young adolescents. So I sense the Epstein story is not primarily about hardcore intelligence agencies seeking to blackmail the wealthy and powerful. Although obviously I could be wrong about that, and it's obvious that Israeli intelligence lurks in the background here, nor is it about the insidious workings of dark money in any kind of precise or clockwork or organized way. I suspect the story is more about the fuzzy psychodynamics found among certain members of the power elite. My sense is that certain personality types and deviant psychologies attract each other magnetically and naturally mesh. So there was a quality in Epstein's particular brand of sociopathy and disassociation that exerted a kind of magnetic pull on other similarly dissociated, vaguely sociopathic character types. This ranged from, Bill Clinton to Bill Gates to Donald Trump to Prince Andrew and so on. So all of these guys share an overarching belief in their own entitlement, their innate superiority. And for many of them, this includes believing they have the right to indulge in their erotic proclivities, their desires, even if those fall outside of the legal system. Unless I'm missing something, or more comes to light, Epstein's sexual abuse, rape, and this grooming of poor young girls to pass along to his cronies, of course, it was utterly despicable, immoral, and illegal. Even so, it never reached anywhere near the kind of Sadian depths of wickedness practiced by the European network of child traffickers and even ritual murderers that are chronicled in Aniki Lucas's harrowing memoir, Quest for Love. Obviously, until the last century, it was more or less accepted that old, wealthy men would sexually exploit teenage girls. Of course, that doesn't make it right. Of course, it's horrible. But I mean, unless there's far more to the story, what happened with Epstein really wasn't so horrible compared to what went on in England with Jimmy Savile, or in Belgium as Anneke Lucas chronicles. And you can really check out those cases if you want to be deeply shocked and horrified by these elite networks of wealthy nihilist libertines. And of course, we still don't actually know what else took place. We don't know what was done in that bizarre gold-domed Byzantine temple on Epstein's Island. We don't know what's in those tens of thousands of hours of video that former Florida Attorney General Pam Bondi mentioned. I mean, unless, of course, she was also lying about that, which is quite possible, if also very confusing. Why lie about that? Then there's Jean-Luc Brunel, founder of modeling agencies and an Epstein procurer, who died in a French prison under suspicious circumstances that were absolutely identical to Epstein's, quote unquote, suicide. So why is this such a sticking point for MAGA? So according to the QAnon myth and the MAGA rhetoric, the sexual abuse of, children, particularly young white women, was meant to be this incredibly terrible thing. This is the thing that vile Democrats and WF Wall Street bankers did, World Economic Forum, monstrosities. This was like the ultimate evil that underlies every other form of corruption and rot. And it explains why liberals are actually secretly far worse than anybody on the right. So if it turns out that Trump is no different from all these other power players and covering up this like dark truth, then the entire ideology, the symbolic architecture of the MAGA movement kind of collapses. There's really nothing left to hold it up. They really don't have any other values they support, I guess, except making the United States into a tech fascist white Christian nation, when most people are reduced to serfs, using massive cruelty against the poor and immigrants, and maybe, claiming that border security is some like ultimate thing. And ironically, the movement doesn't really care about other abused children at all. I mean, check out this video.
Fucking Nazis! We can hear you, kids! Fuck you, nice fucking Nazis!
So I had assumed the brainwashed MAGA cults and its influencers understood that it was all bullshit. After all, QAnon is itself an obvious fraud. Trump is a grifter and an inveterate liar. Epstein was Trump's best friend for a decade. We already know from criminal investigations that Mar-a-Lago was in itself used to sex traffic young girls to Epstein, who actually just lived right down the street. So I never imagined the Epstein files would be revealed, and assumed everybody knew that. However, I now see there was a deeper layer that I was missing. There's a symbolic order propping up the MAGA movement, and this is not easy for Trump even to escape. So the deeper analysis provides some hope, although I don't want us to get too excited, that the Epstein scandal could, in fact, critically wound the MAGA cult and eventually even take down the fascist right. And to understand why this is so, we would first need to explore some ideas from psychoanalysts Sigmund Freud and Jacques Lacan, who talked about fetishism, patriarchal authority, and disavowal. And this can give us some surprising insights into this situation. I also believe that when we go into this analysis, we understand what Musk is trying to do instinctively as he goes after Trump. For those who don't know, we talk about who was Jacques Lacan. I'm sure you all know Freud. Lacan's ideas might be central for us to help us understand what's happening here. Lacan was a French psychoanalyst who lived from 1901 to 1981. He's probably the most influential psychoanalyst after Freud himself. Jacques Lacan took Freud's insights about the unconscious and desire, and he developed them through the lens of structural linguistics and philosophy. And his work is very, very difficult, almost impenetrable. He wrote in a deliberately kind of Mandarin, obscure style. But I think even so, there are core insights there that can be useful and even profound as we try to understand what's happening with the MAGA base. Lacan argued that the unconscious is structured like a language, and there were fundamentally split subjects, always seeking something we can never fully have. he developed concepts like the symbolic order, the realm of language, law, and social structure that we must enter to become functioning subjects. He also explored how power operates through what he called master signifiers, words or symbols or sort of icons that anchor an entire worldview, even when they don't refer to anything concrete. Most importantly for our purposes, Lacan understood that people don't just rationally choose their beliefs. Instead, they're driven by unconscious desires and fantasies that organize their entire relationship to reality. This is why purely rational political analysis often fails to explain why people support obviously contradictory or self-destructive movements. Okay, with that context, let's examine how Trump supporters, or the broader MAGA movement, operate not just as a political bloc, but as a psychological formation that must hold a symbolic structure together. So the MAGA cult works by investing the followers' libidinal drives into a deep identification with their leader, Donald Trump. The MAGA worldview constructs a constricted psychic economy built on a fantasy. Lacan uses the word jouissance, which translates roughly as perverse enjoyment, to describe the kind of dark pleasure experienced by Donald Trump's followers. Trump functions for them as this master signifier, this fetish object that anchors their sense of self and worlds. According to Lacanian theory, contradictions are not errors to be corrected. They are essential features that support their fantasy. So the MAGA cultist doesn't simply repress these contradictions. They sort of enjoy the dissonance produced by them. The contradictions actually provide an effective, energetic charge. And this is why Trump supporters can simultaneously believe Trump to be a billionaire magnate and a voice for the forgotten, a Christ-like redemptive hero, as well as a man of vulgar excess and disgusting, even repulsive character flaws. So these are not just glitches. The sort of friction or the frisson of the contradictions are structural features that intensify the fantasy that the MAGA cultists maintain. Fantasy functions as like a screen. It organizes the subject's desire in relation to what Lacan called the real, the traumatic core of social antagonism that cannot be symbolized. These are real things like class warfare, racial anger, sexual anxiety, and those things need to be suppressed because they're too threatening to face directly. So you retreat into the fantasy, into the screen, the projection. From a Lacanian perspective, Trump acts as this kind of phallic principle or master signifier who promises to protect his devotees from the chaos of the real, so they don't have to confront their, what Freud called castration anxiety in a social and psychological sense. Hence, Trump's popular slogan, "I alone can fix it." Lacan draws a distinction between knowledge and belief. Someone might know Trump has lied or acts in ways that contradict what he says, but they do not believe it in their unconscious depths. Lacan has a name for this type of disavowal, je sais bien, mais quand même. I know very well, but all the same. So despite and because of these contradictions, Trump's followers continue to invest in the symbolic structure. At this point, their libidinal economy, their whole identity, depends on it. And it is important also to remember that identity is never a fixed thing. It always is relational, it always changes or can change. And that is what makes this particular juncture, this kind of loss of faith and belief, so fascinating. So the MAGA cult has positioned Trump as a kind of father figure in this Lacanian sense. Not an actual father, but the one who gives structure to the symbolic order. Lacan calls this the name of the father, or nom du père. In Lacanian psychoanalysis, the name of the father is a central concept. It marks the entry of the subject into the symbolic order, language, law, and social structure. This originates in Lacan's rereading of Freud's Oedipus complex, where the child's early desire for the mother must be interrupted or castrated by the paternal function. This interruption is not necessarily the literal father, but a symbolic operation, the imposition of a prohibition that redirects desire and anchors the child within the shared universe of language and culture. Trump acts out his followers' fantasy of a mythic return to order, power, and potency, a symbolic remembering or decastration. His contradictions are absorbed, even embraced, as signs of his authenticity. And this includes his transgressions of social propriety, his insults, his vicious attacks on his enemies. For the lower classes, the MAGA movement is quite obviously not about rational self-interest. In fact, Trump's policies will be disastrous, even fatal for many of his followers. So it's about a kind of enjoyment, luxuriating in a dark, masochistic form of pleasure. That's what they're getting from it. Lacan's concept of jouissance helps us see why humiliation of liberals, elites, or even of the followers themselves is actually part of his appeal. Trumpism enables a shared enjoyment in transgression, cruelty, and even societal collapse or breakdown. This is why the scandals often reinforce his supporters' fervor. They intensify the pleasure of identifying with him through all of the crises and contradictions. So what about the Epstein revelations? Why are they such a threat? Well, the Epstein revelations pose a threat because they point to an internal contradiction that cannot be easily disavowed or suppressed. So if Trump, instead of being a misunderstood outsider, is really completely implicated and in fact belongs to the same elite pedophilic network that MAGA has defined itself against, that may actually permanently fracture their fantasy. The fantasy will be dissolved in a way that can't be evaded or repressed or covered over. And this kind of fracture could bring the MAGA subject too close to the real, the traumatic core that the fantasy was constructed to avoid. In Lacanian terms, this could trigger a breakdown of the symbolic order, a psychotic foreclosure, a collective disidentification. If the name of the father is stripped of authority, this exposes the subject to a form of symbolic castration, a loss of coherence and faith in the ideological structure that holds his or her fragile world together. So Trump functions as this kind of fetish object, this master signifier, and we have to move beyond normal categories of political analysis to understand the role he's playing in the MAGA psyche. You know, of course, we all know he's a demagogue, he's a liar, he's a narcissist. Those labels are all true, but they're not getting at the psychic core of his appeal to his masses, to his MAGA base. And in psychoanalytic terms, Trump is something far more structurally important. He's both a fetish object and a master signifier. His presence organizes desire and belief. He resolves, or at least he covers over, the otherwise unbearable contradictions haunting the inner psychic lives of his followers. According to Freud's theory of fetishism, the fetish emerges as a defense against traumatic knowledge. Originally for Freud, the boy's realization that the mother doesn't have a penis, she lacks a penis. Freud believed that this insight threatened the boy's sense of his own integrity. And to preserve psychic wholeness, the subject splits. He both accepts and denies the truth. The fetish object, it could be a shoe, a piece of hair, a certain gesture, becomes the stand-in for what has been lost. Freud wrote, "The horror of castration has set up a memorial to itself in the fetish. The fetish substitutes for the maternal phallus the little boy once believed in and does not want to release." Trump becomes a fetish object in the Freudian sense because he covers over the lack that animates the MAGA worldview, the lost authority of the white patriarch, the collapse of American exceptionalism, the humiliation caused by globalization and cultural liberalism, and the MAGA base's own economic dispossession. So they're suffering from a kind of totalizing social and psychological form of castration anxiety. And they can't resolve it, but they can use a fantasy to mask it over, which is what Trump provides. So his transgressive and obscene kind of presence, his image, stands in for the power that his followers don't want to admit that they have forfeited or lost forever. And therefore they go into this idea that America is going to be great again under Trump. You know, that's another one of his slogans. So Trump plays the role of what Lacan calls the master signifier. It doesn't refer to a particular concept, but rather it is an empty center that anchors the subject's entire symbolic universe. He ties together disparate and even contradictory threads. Evangelical Christianity with its kind of puritism, casino vulgarity, blue-collar resentment and billionaire indulgence, victimhood and messianism. It all is kind of conflated together under one unifying construct. So what the Epstein case threatens is not just Trump's reputation, but his structural position as both fetish and master signifier. If the suppressed truth that he was part of the elite sexual political pedo game from the start with all the other people they hate, this could pierce the screen and the entire economy of the fantasy then collapses. The MAGA cult victims can no longer hide or cover over the lack because they realize they are in it, they personify it, they embody it. And the fetish object of cultic belief becomes contaminated with the real. It needs to be discarded. So what happens then? So here, Lacan's theory is not going to be able to predict MAGA's future behavior for us, but it can help us think structurally about the situation. If the fantasy collapses, that disillusionment could turn inward, could become depression or apathy, or it could be channeled into even more extreme forms of reactionary aggression if it's pushed outward. The desire for coherence might reconfigure around even darker conspiracies as a way to restabilize this dark pleasure, this jouissance, despite facing this disintegration of identity. Or the MAGA cult may seek a new fetish object, a new master signifier or name of the father. In political terms, this would mean pivoting to a new leader, such as RFK Jr. or Elon Musk. So I think we could see that, Musk's original post on X, or what was once called Twitter, that launched this crisis in MAGA symbolic order was actually, on his part, kind of a genius strategic intervention. When Musk said Trump was on Epstein's list, he forced MAGA to demand to know why the list had not been released yet. This forced the White House to finally take a stand and reject the very existence of the Epstein files and try to close the case altogether, even though releasing all of the Epstein material is one of the main promises Trump and all of the MAGA influencers had made to their followers over and over again. So I think, one interpretation of what's happening is that Musk and Trump have actually entered into a very serious power struggle. And Musk possesses a great deal of control over most MAGA influencers through his platform X, since he can demonetize or promote them at will. They're all dependent on the paid subscriptions they get through his site. In a way, Laura Loomer, Charlie Kirk, Jack Posobiec, and so on are like, vassals in Musk's media empire. They're like employees or data serfs working the fields of their techno-feudal overlord. They owe him fealty. They owe him perhaps more loyalty than the loyalty they owe to Trump. And we now know that Musk isn't as likable or intellectually sophisticated as he once seemed. We've had years of shitposts that have showed Musk's political proclivities, his love of neo-Nazi and racist and anti-Semitic content, his willingness to lie brazenly and do whatever it takes, and so on. But we also can see, unfortunately, that Musk is a kind of genius at power struggles and at winning power games. I mean, he has a very powerful, instinctive power drive, and he's brilliant at it. He's managed to maintain his position as CEO at several huge corporations, overcoming any opposition while he's tweeting hundreds of times a day, pretending to be amazing at video games, and running like this huge fascistic political operation of Doge. So what I would conclude from all of this, another thing that's happening is, the Supreme Court is kind of dismantling, the Constitution, the rule of law. So everything in America is sort of coming up for grabs. And, it could be the case that Musk has maintained dictatorial ambitions about gaining control over the United States. And what we're witnessing right now is just the very beginning of a battle for control of the right and also the country as a whole between Elon Musk and Donald Trump. And Elon Musk's tweet attack was just the first strategically brilliant salvo. So I don't know if anybody can say what will follow at this point or who will win, as any result seems possible. By the way, if you enjoyed this essay, please please subscribe to my YouTube, we'll think about this more soon, I hope.